In this video, I'll show you how to make a shrimp ecosystem inside a glass jar. It's super easy to care for, making it perfect for beginners, and it doesn't even need a filter. Now let's get straight into the build. It's going to be a good one. For the lighting, I'm using this LED display light which has a nice wooden base at the bottom. It's relatively low powered, making it perfect for a low tech and low maintenance setup like this one. The glass jar is roughly 5 litres, which is just over 1 US gallon. I've already attached a foam mat to the bottom to ensure that it sits nice and level. I want to keep this setup really low budget with materials that are super easy to source. This here is some garden topsoil. This will go right at the base of the ecosystem and will be the source of nutrients for all the plants inside. You really don't need too much, especially in a small setup like this one. I'll put a list of all the materials and plants used in this build in the description below, along with some links. All I'm doing now is using my hand to flatten it out and make a nice even layer. It really doesn't look like much is in there, but this would be more than enough. I'm now going to completely soak it in water so there'll be no air bubbles trapped down in the substrate. This layer needs to be capped off, otherwise the nutrients will leach out into the water column, which will certainly cause algae issues. To do this, all I'm using is some fine aquarium gravel. You want this layer to be at least a couple centimeters thick. I've run out of gravel, but some coarse sand is going to work just as well. I'm sloping up the gravel towards the back, as this will help create a nice sense of depth inside the jar. Now it's time for the hardscape. I've got this nice piece of driftwood which I think has the potential to look good inside this setup. With it inside the jar, it does seem a little bit too big for this setup, so I'm going to go ahead and chop it down. It fits in a lot better, but I'm not loving how it looks, and I do feel like it takes up a bit too much ground space for the plants. Instead, I'm going to try out this spiderwood branch with some trident fern mounted on it. I've had this piece in a setup before, so it's nice and established. Instantly, I think it looks a lot better and much more suiting to the small jar. To give it a bit more height and stability inside the setup, I'm going to attach a rock to the base. This will also ensure that it won't float up once the jar is filled with water. I'll attach the rock to the wood using the super glue and tissue method. Don't worry, this method is 100% shrimp safe. Now the glue's dry, I can place the wood back inside the jar and press the rock down into the gravel to make it nice and stable. I've done the same with another piece of spiderwood which will branch out to the right side of the scape. I love the simplicity of this scape and the fact that there's so much ground space for plants, as that's essential in a no-filter ecosystem like this one. I think the foreground of the scape will look nicer with some decorative gravel. This gravel is in no way essential to the scape, but I really like how it looks and think it'll add some nice detail to the foreground. I'm doing my best to spread the gravel out with some long tweezers and then finishing it off with some fine gravel from before. Once these stones are wet, they have some really nice natural colours to them. For the background, I've got 2 pots of Limnophila. This plant is super easy to grow and has some nice bushy leaves which will fill out the background nicely. I've taken them out the pots, removed all the rock wool and split them up into 4 even bundles. I can now take some long tweezers and plant them down into the gravel. I am planting them relatively deep just so they don't float up and they're closer to the nutrients at the base. This is a fast growing plant, so it's going to do a lot of the work in keeping this ecosystem nice and clean. That being said, I am going to have to keep on top of maintenance, as I don't want it overgrowing the entire setup. It's already starting to look like a slice of nature, but there's still plenty of plants to come. I think this crypt will act as a nice centerpiece plant. I'm going to plant it just in front of the spiderwood. I'm digging a small hole with the tweezers and then planting the roots down inside. This plant has been grown out of water, so its appearance will change as it adapts to underwater life. I think this Lilaeopsis will look nice on the left and right side of the scape. With time, hopefully it will send out runners into the foreground. I'm purposely using plants with different shape, colour, size and texture to hopefully add to the natural look of this aquarium. I'm really liking how it's looking so far, but I think some Bucephalandra is going to make it look even better. I've got a couple different species that will add some nice detail to the scape. I'm using a small amount of gel type superglue to mount it down in place. I think some small Anubias is also a great addition. Now the planting's complete, this nano aquarium is really taking shape. It's about time this jar gets filled up with water. A small piece of bubble wrap helps disperse the water and stops it from destroying the scape. I often get questions about what water I use for my scapes, and the answer is just regular tap water. Obviously I make sure it's dechlorinated, but that's all there is to it. It's great to see the jar finally filled up with water. Before I can add any inhabitants, the underwater ecosystem needs to be left to establish. It's only been 8 days since I set up this ecosystem jar and it's already looking a whole lot better. Despite there being no filter, there's been no problems with algae or water quality whatsoever. This is a great sign that the plants are doing their job in filtering the water and keeping it nice and clean. As I'm sure you can see, the Limnophila has grown right to the surface, so I'm going to give it a quick trim back. I'll replant these stems after doing a 20% water change. This is the first water change I've done, and I probably won't do another one for another couple weeks. In a no filter setup like this one, I've found it better to do less frequent water changes. This makes the parameters consistent and keeps the ecosystem balanced. That being said, I still like to test the water multiple times a week just to make sure everything's good. Now let's introduce the first inhabitants to this ecosystem. I've got a small group of these tiny snails. They won't really get any bigger than this, and they'll feed on things like algae growing inside the jar. This one landed upside down, but it soon pulled itself upright and started exploring. It's great to see some life in this jar, but I do want to let it establish a little bit longer before introducing any more. The ecosystem jar is now 50 days old, and I'm glad to say that it's thriving. I've done 3 water changes in that time, and the jar has been receiving 10 hours of light a day. All the plants have grown in really well, and they've been keeping the water quality perfect with no algae in sight. The roots of the plants have found their way down to the nutrient layer, which is a big reason for that. A few weeks ago, I added a small group of cherry shrimp to call this ecosystem their home. Let's see how they're doing. They've really been thriving in this setup, and their vibrant red colour really helps them stand out amongst the green plants. They do seem a bit camera shy and swim off as soon as I press record. Upon closer inspection, there's even a few tiny babies roaming throughout the jar. It's always great to see this, as breeding is a sign of a healthy ecosystem. If their population grows too much, I will take some out, as I don't want food to become scarce. So far, I haven't put any food inside the ecosystem, and they've simply been thriving off the biofilm that grows inside. This also goes for the tiny snails, which, as you can see, they've been working hard to keep the glass nice and clean. If you're interested in seeing detailed updates on my ecosystems, be sure to check out my weekly newsletter, Wednesday Updates. It also contains behind the scenes look at upcoming projects, and best of all, it's completely free. I'll put a link in the description so you can check it out. I really hope you found this video useful, and if you've never tried making something like this before, I highly recommend you give it a go.